I had lived in my house for years, enjoying the quiet suburban life, but ever since Karen moved in next door, things had become complicated. She wasn't just your typical annoying neighbor. She was the entitled neighbor, the kind who believed that property lines were just suggestions and that rules didn't apply to her. The first time I had an issue with her was over parking, of course. I had a two-car garage, and my driveway was spacious enough for visitors. But Karen, despite having her own garage and driveway, seemed to think my property was an extension of hers. It started small. She'd pull into my driveway for just a few minutes to unload groceries or let a guest park there just for today. I had politely asked her not to, but every time she waved me off with that infuriating Karen tone. Oh, it's no big deal. You're not even using it right now. Things escalated when I caught her trying to park in my garage one morning. I had left it open while working on a project, and when I came back from grabbing my tools, there she was, casually pulling her SUV inside like she owned the place. I was too stunned to speak at first, but when I confronted her, she acted as if I was the crazy one. "Oh, I thought you wouldn't mind," she said, laughing as she stepped out of her car. "It's just so hot outside, and my driveway gets so much sun. Your garage has such nice shade." That was the moment I realized Karen didn't just ignore boundaries. She didn't believe in them. I told her firmly that my garage was not for her use, and that I didn't appreciate her assuming she could just take over my space. She pouted but finally backed her car out, grumbling under her breath about how I was being dramatic. For a while, things seemed fine. But then, one fateful afternoon, I came home to find her SUV parked inside my locked garage again. This time, she had manually lifted the garage door while I was at work, parked her car inside, and shut it down like it was hers. I was beyond livid. I stormed over to her house, knocking so hard that the door rattled. When she finally answered, she had the audacity to act surprised. "Oh, you're home already?" she said with a fake, innocent smile. "I was going to move it before you got back." My patience snapped. I told her that this was trespassing, that she had no right to be inside my garage, and that if she ever pulled this stunt again, I would take serious action. She rolled her eyes, still playing the victim. "Geez, calm down. It's not like I stole anything. You're so territorial." That night, I stewed in anger. Karen wasn't going to stop unless I did something drastic. And then an idea hit me. My garage had an automatic locking system from the outside. Once locked, it couldn't be opened without the key or the manual release inside the house. And I had security cameras. The next time Karen tried this stunt, I'd be ready. I didn't have to wait long for Karen to take the bait. Just 3 days after our last argument, I decided to test my theory. Before leaving for work, I left my garage door unlocked but made sure my security cameras were fully operational. I also made sure my garage's automatic locking mechanism was in place, meaning that once shut from the outside, the only way to open it was either through the house or with the keypad code that only I knew. As I pulled out of my driveway, I had a gut feeling that today would be the day Karen tried something bold. And sure enough, a few hours later, I got a motion alert from my security cameras. I pulled up the live feed on my phone, and there she was, Karen, walking up to my garage like she owned the place, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. She confidently lifted the door manually, which I later realized she had figured out how to do in case I locked it, and pulled her SUV inside like it was her personal parking space. She got out, adjusted her sunglasses, and even took a moment to admire how well her car fit inside my garage. My blood boiled, but at the same time, I smirked. This was exactly what I had been waiting for. I waited until I was just a few blocks from home, then activated the garage door's remote lock from my phone. With a quiet beep, the mechanism engaged, and the heavy door slammed shut from the outside, sealing her SUV and Karen herself inside. No way out. No escape. For a moment, I just watched through the security feed. At first, Karen didn't even realize what had happened. She took her time, checking her makeup in the side mirror, scrolling through her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. Then she turned to leave, only to find the garage door wouldn't budge. She frowned, tried it again, then started yanking on the handle with increasing frustration. Now panic set in. She pounded on the door, tried using the emergency pull cord, which I had discreetly disabled, then pulled out her phone. I knew exactly what was coming. Not even a minute later, my phone started ringing. It was Karen. I didn't pick up. She called again, and again, and again. I smiled to myself as I parked my car several miles away at a friend's house and turned off my phone completely. Karen was on her own now, locked inside my garage with her car, no way to get out and no way to contact me. She had been so sure she could get away with this, and now she was trapped in the very space she thought she could steal. I wasn't coming back anytime soon. I was going on a little vacation, and Karen was about to learn a very long, very uncomfortable lesson. With my phone turned off and my car parked miles away, I was completely off Karen's radar. Meanwhile, she was still locked inside my garage, growing more frantic by the second. Later, when I reviewed the security footage, I saw exactly how her breakdown unfolded, and let me tell you, it was priceless. At first, she was just confused. She paced around, checked her phone, and muttered to herself. She kept trying the door handle, her frustration building as she yanked harder and harder. Then she started banging on the garage door, screaming, "Hello? Hello? Let me out." But of course, no one answered. The garage was soundproof enough that her voice wasn't carrying beyond the walls. That's when the real panic set in. She pulled out her phone and tried to call me again, over and over. I later saw that she left at least 30 missed calls and voicemails in the span of 2 hours. Each one got more desperate than the last. I laughed out loud listening to that last one. "Oh, Karen, you still think you're in control." At one point, she tried to pry the door open using a screwdriver she found in the garage toolbox, but the lock was too strong. Then she tried breaking a window, but the only small ones were covered with reinforced glass. She even tried ramming her car into the door, thinking she could force her way out, but I had installed a heavy-duty security door, and all she accomplished was scratching her own SUV. After 5 hours of pure desperation, she finally gave up. She slumped onto the hood of her car, fanning herself with her phone, drenched in sweat. The sun was going down now, and the temperature was dropping. I could almost feel the realization creeping in. She was stuck here overnight. That's when she called her husband. Now, Greg, her husband, was just as entitled as she was, but at least he had half a brain. When he finally arrived, he tried everything, banging on my front door, ringing the doorbell, even calling the police to demand I release his wife. But with no proof that she had permission to be in my garage in the first place, the cops weren't exactly on her side. When they asked, "Sir, does your wife have permission to park in this garage?" Greg stammered and dodged the question. That was enough for them to wave it off as a civil dispute rather than a crime on my part. With no legal grounds to force my garage open, Karen was officially out of options. By now, she was furious, humiliated, and exhausted, and I was just getting started. At this point, Karen was completely trapped in my garage, humiliated and out of options. Her husband, Greg, had tried everything, banging on my door, calling the cops, even pretending this was all just a misunderstanding. But nothing worked because he couldn't admit the truth. Karen had trespassed onto my property and parked in my garage without permission. With nightfall settling in and no sign of me, Greg made one last desperate attempt, calling a locksmith. Now, I had anticipated this. My garage's security system was designed with break-in prevention in mind, and the lock wasn't something a standard locksmith could bypass without the proper code. The locksmith took one look at the reinforced locks and security keypad and shook his head. "Sorry, buddy," he told Greg. "This isn't something I can open without the owner's consent. It's a high-security system." Greg was fuming. Karen, meanwhile, was losing her mind inside the garage. I had shut off my Wi-Fi in the garage, meaning she had no signal on her phone. She was sitting in total isolation, stewing in her own entitlement, completely helpless. And this was the moment I decided to take my ultimate power move. While Karen was sitting in my garage like a caged animal, I packed my bags, left a note on my front door that said, "Gone for the weekend," and drove to a cabin 3 hours away. I wasn't just ignoring her. I was removing myself entirely. She had assumed that I would come back eventually, that I'd have no choice but to let her out. But no, I wasn't even in town anymore. For the next 3 days, Karen was stuck in my garage with nothing but her car, a toolbox, and her rapidly depleting patience. And what did she do during those 3 days? She went through every stage of grief. Denial, she kept convincing herself I'd come back any minute now. Anger, she screamed, cursed, and banged on the walls. Security footage showed her throwing a full tantrum at one point, stomping and kicking boxes like a child. Bargaining, she tried leaving fake apologies on my voicemail, saying she was sorry and that we could work this out. Depression. By day 2, she was sitting in her car, defeated, eating stale granola bars she found in her glove box. Acceptance. By the time I returned, she was a broken woman. The security footage was comedy gold. Watching Karen go from smug entitlement to absolute despair over 3 days was the most satisfying thing I had ever seen. And when I finally got back home, the moment I pulled into my driveway, Karen's voice rang out desperately from inside the garage. "Oh my God, you're back. Open the door. Please." I smiled. She was finally ready to talk. I stepped out of my car, stretched my arms like I had just returned from the most relaxing vacation ever, and took my sweet time walking up to the garage. Inside, Karen was pounding on the door, her voice hoarse from screaming for who knows whom. "You locked me in here. This is illegal. You're going to be arrested," she shrieked, her tone bouncing between rage and desperation. I smirked. "Oh, illegal? You mean like breaking into my garage and parking in it without permission?" I crossed my arms and stared at the small security camera mounted outside. "Because I have all the evidence I need to press trespassing charges if that's the game you want to play." Silence. That was when I heard her voice crack just a little. "Come on," she tried, shifting her tone. I didn't think it was a big deal. I was just parking for a bit, and then the door shut. I got stuck in here by accident." I almost laughed. She was still trying to play the victim. "Right," I said, pulling out my phone. "Well, good thing I have security footage showing you sneaking in when I wasn't home, and trying to force the door open, and calling a locksmith, and damaging your own car trying to ram your way out." There was another long silence. Then came her final stage, humiliation. "Look, she swallowed. I could hear her voice trembling now. I just want to go home. Please, can we just forget about this?" Oh, now she wanted to be civil. I let her stew for another moment before sighing dramatically. "You know, Karen, I really shouldn't even open this door. I should just call the cops and let them deal with you." "No, please, no cops," she blurted. There it was, the real fear. The moment she realized she was entirely at my mercy. After one last pause, I let out a fake sigh of pity and pulled out my garage remote. I pressed the button, and with a loud mechanical groan, the heavy door finally lifted. The bright morning sun flooded inside, nearly blinding Karen, who looked like she had been through absolute hell. Her hair was a mess, her clothes were wrinkled, her makeup was smeared, and the sheer defeat in her face was glorious. She stumbled out, shielding her eyes as she stepped into the light like a feral cave dweller emerging from exile. Her husband, Greg, was already in their driveway, watching with a mix of embarrassment and quiet fury. I had no doubt he'd spent the last few days listening to her sob through the garage door, unable to do a thing about it. Without saying another word, Karen sprinted to her SUV, jumped in, and tore out of my driveway so fast her tires screeched. Greg, looking thoroughly done with the situation, gave me a single nod before following her home. I stood there, arms crossed, watching them retreat like defeated villains in a bad sitcom. But before I went inside, I made sure to install a brand new security system for my garage, this time with an alarm that would trigger if anyone even tried to open it manually. Karen was never, ever going to pull this stunt again. You would think that after spending 3 miserable days locked in my garage, Karen would have learned her lesson. That she'd keep her head down, swallow her pride, and pretend the whole thing never happened. But no, Karen was still Karen. The very next day, I got word that she had gone to the HOA to complain about me. That's right, after trespassing, stealing my garage space, and getting trapped because of her own stupidity, she was still trying to play the victim. I heard this from my friend, Mrs. Carmichael, who had been living in the neighborhood long before Karen showed up. She called me that morning, barely able to contain her laughter. "You are not going to believe this," she said. "Karen went to the HOA demanding they take action against you." I almost choked on my coffee. For what? Oh, kidnapping her vehicle and unlawful imprisonment. I nearly fell out of my chair. She really went to the HOA with that? Oh, yes, Mrs. Carmichael said, barely containing her giggles. She was hysterical, talking about how you trapped her in hot, airless garage like an animal, and how she could have died, even though we all know she had her car, her AC, and snacks the entire time. I smirked. And what did the HOA say? Well, the HOA president laughed in her face. That was it. I howled with laughter. Apparently, the HOA knew all about Karen's entitled behavior. This wasn't her first time trying to manipulate them into punishing someone she didn't like. The president shut her down immediately, reminding her that my property was not under HOA jurisdiction and that if she had trespassed into my garage, that was her fault. And to make matters even sweeter, the HOA sent out an email to the entire neighborhood clarifying that homeowners have full control over their own property and that no one is allowed to enter or park on private property without permission. Translation: a public humiliation letter directed straight at Karen. After that, Karen became the laughingstock of the neighborhood. Neighbors started telling the story at BBQs and block parties, calling it the Great Garage Incident. Some even made memes about it in the community Facebook group, like a photoshopped image of Karen looking out from behind garage bars like a prisoner. Greg was mortified. While Karen sulked around the neighborhood, glaring at anyone who smirked in her direction, Greg started avoiding people altogether. The guy was clearly done with the drama. And then came the final nail in the coffin. A few months later, a for sale sign popped up in Karen's front yard. She and Greg were moving. Maybe it was the humiliation. Maybe it was the fact that everyone in the neighborhood now saw her as an entitled joke. Maybe Greg had finally gotten tired of her BS. But either way, Karen was finally gone. The day the moving truck pulled out, I stood on my porch, sipping a cold drink, watching as Karen climbed into her car for the last time. Our eyes met for a brief second. She knew she had lost. Without a word, she turned away and drove off, leaving behind nothing but her terrible reputation and an empty house. I smiled. I had won. And more importantly, I never had to deal with her parking in my garage again.